Hello, listeners. Welcome back to a special episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Today, we're going to do a little solo podcast episode on the Chinese spy balloon incident. Part of me doesn't even want to talk about this because I don't think it's particularly important. I even hesitated on recording this podcast this morning because I thought, you know what, it's already passed out of the news cycle. There's the Turkey-Syria earthquake. There are more important things. Maybe it's not worth it. And then I saw a thing pop up that said, maybe there's a second spy balloon that is flying over Latin America. This is from the BBC 4 hours ago, and China has claimed that it's theirs. When I saw the news about the second spy balloon, I decided, you know what, we really need to deal with this. I'm going to step on the thesis of this solo cast right away. This is not that important an issue. And the podcast that we did with Miles on nuclear fusion and published earlier this week, much more important. And if you want to learn something about the world and something that could really change the world, I would encourage you to listen to that podcast and not just focus on what is in the headlines. But we can't avoid this Chinese spy balloon story. I became aware of the spy balloon this Saturday. Was making breakfast with my wife and my brother-in-law and his girlfriend. And CNN was on in the background, not my choice, but it was on in the background. And they were literally in real time, tracking the progress of the spy balloon 24/7. When I got up on Sunday morning and opened up the Sunday edition of the New York Times, again, the front page was all about this Chinese spy balloon. And I just don't understand why people care so much. Apparently what's going on here is that the balloon entered American airspace around the southern tip of Alaska on Saturday, January 28th. It then crisscrossed into Canadian airspace, floated back into U.S. airspace over northern Idaho. At that point, according to the Washington Post, the United States considered shooting it down, but they felt like it didn't pose a big enough threat, and that the threat of actually damaging sort of infrastructure on the ground or even potentially hurting someone by shooting it down was a bigger risk than letting the balloon simply fly away. So it slowly progressed across the country until people started fixating on it, and CNN decided to go 24/7 on it. By the end of last week, the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, said that he was going to postpone his visit to Beijing in part as a result of this quote-unquote surveillance balloon. The Department of Defense spokesperson said it was clearly a surveillance balloon. I really don't want to get into a he said, she said here, which is funny because, Xi Jinping, there's a whole bunch of puns that we can make there. For what it's worth, the Chinese Foreign Ministry said that they did have an unmanned airship that was in sort of U.S. space. They said that it was not really a spy balloon. They said it is a civilian airship used for meteorological research purposes, that it was blown off course and had limited self-steering capability, and that they regretted the unintended entry of the airship into U.S. airspace. After the United States shot it down, took out the fighter jets apparently to shoot the spy balloon down, China said that they were very angry and expressed strong dissatisfaction and opposition towards the United States. That's a little crazy in and of its own right, because it's one thing to say, okay, it's this random civilian spy balloon that tracked off course. I don't see how you can be pissed off about another country shooting down an unidentified object in their airspace. So I don't really understand why China has its panties in a wad there either. But back and forth, the United States-China relationship apparently is going to get hung up on yet another snag here, and it's going to be a stupid spy balloon incident. The Department of Defense itself says that this is not that big of a deal. Let's just read a couple things from the Pentagon briefing on this. The first is that the balloon was traveling at an altitude well above commercial air traffic and does not present a military or physical threat to people on the ground. The Pentagon said that instances of this kind of balloon activity have been observed previously over the past several years. And also, and I think this is the real key, the Pentagon assessed that this balloon has limited additive value from an intelligence collection perspective. Nevertheless, they are taking steps to protect against foreign intelligence collection of sensitive information. Now, look, I'm not here to tell you that China isn't trying to spy on the United States. I'm also not here to tell you that the United States isn't trying to spy on China. I'm also not telling you that this theme in general is something that should really concern us. I have been talking and writing for years about how space is probably going to be one of the key geopolitical zones of conflict in the years and decades ahead. I spend a lot of time reading about satellites and all the sorts of weapons development and high altitude weapons development and technology that's happening around the world, because I think this really is going to be a domain where we need to think a little bit more seriously. But there's a big difference between thinking about, say, how a country like China or a US rival could be developing technology to blind US satellites versus a spy balloon that apparently wandered off course into US airspace. Let's say it even is a spy balloon for the sake of argument. Let's say that the Chinese are full of shit, and they totally possibly could be. They are not going to learn anything from this spy balloon that they don't already know about the United States. This is not a Sputnik moment. This is not even a Soviet, U-2 reconnaissance plane flying over the United States. This is a balloon that it looks like, they couldn't even steer the thing away. It's a fairly unsophisticated thing. And even the Pentagon is telling you that this thing has no additive value from an intelligence perspective. What I think is disturbing about this is how the United States has reacted. And I say that on the governmental level, I say that on the media level, and I say that even on sort of the day-to-day personal level. If we spent the same amount of time here in the United States focusing on our actual problems as we did on the spy balloon, some things might get better. Now, what are those actual problems? What did the Chinese spy balloon actually see, assuming that it could actually see what was going on down on the ground in the United States? It would see that the United States has terrible infrastructure. According to the World Economic Forum, the United States ranks 13th in quality infrastructure in the world. It would see that 45,000 of our bridges are in danger of falling apart or in disrepair. It would find that 1 in 5 miles of roads are in danger of disrepair. It would find that millions of people still drink water out of pipes that are made of lead. It would find, if it read the American Society of Civil Engineer report, that we have a gap of infrastructure spending of $2.6 trillion and that is projected to cost us $10 trillion of GDP out to 2030. It would find that almost 70% of our electric grid is well past the halfway point on its maintenance cycle, that most of it was built in the 1950s and 60s. One report that I saw said that, I believe this was in the New York Times, around the year 2000, there were something like 24 major power outage events in the United States that year. We had over 180 last year in the United States. Our education system is completely uncompetitive. We rate, according to Pew Research, we are 38th out of 71 countries surveyed for math, 24th out of 71 countries surveyed for science. I didn't have time to really get into the details, but if you look at teacher satisfaction, if you look at parental trust in institutions, if you look at graduation rates, there are so many signals that our education system is really not doing particularly well. You've heard me talk about this before. 69% of Americans are overweight. A third of Americans are technically obese. I was interested to look at crime rates, not least because I live in New Orleans, which apparently has the highest murder per capita rate in the United States. We have surpassed Chicago with that wonderful accolade. Homicides were actually down in 2022, down 4%. But property and carjackings and theft and things like that, I should say property crime, carjackings, theft, and things like that were also up. And even though homicides were down 4% overall last year, homicides since the pandemic began in 2020 really have reversed a steady decline that we saw in this country in homicides beginning in the 1990s. And we are now actually back at levels that are relatively similar to the mid to late 1990s in terms of homicide rates and are trending back in the wrong direction. All of that is to say is that the United States has a lot of problems that it is really not focusing on in any meaningful way. The only thing, apparently, that people in Congress can agree on is that China is a boogeyman and that we should be scared of a Chinese weather balloon. I'm not here to make this a political argument. I don't want to tell you what I think, tax levels in the United States should be. I don't want to tell you what I think, U.S. government dollars should be spent on improving. That is beyond my pay grade and not something I'm interested in telling you. I think my listeners can make up their minds for themselves. And a lot of the listeners to this podcast are actually not based in the United States. You probably have your own problems with whatever countries you're listening in, whether it's the UK, Australia, Poland. We have plenty of listeners from around the world. I will say, however, that one of the things that China thinks, one of the reasons that Xi Jinping's government has felt willing to challenge the United States in more areas is that from a Marxist perspective, China thinks that the United States is a country in decline. They want to bide their time over the next decade or two because they don't think that the United States of today is going to be as powerful or as wealthy relative to its current position to the rest of the world today. That's in the sort of Chinese mindset. It's one of the reasons I don't think that the Chinese government is about to go invade Taiwan or do anything really combative towards the United States. Not only do they not have the ability, and not only are they facing all sorts of economic problems, they think the United States is going to collapse in and on itself. And if you go back in US history, you don't even need to talk to analysts like me. Some of the most brilliant leaders that we have ever had in this country have clearly, and I think accurately, pointed out that the biggest threat to the United States is the United States itself. It was Abraham Lincoln who said a house divided cannot stand. It was George Kennan who, in his famous telegram about the Soviet Union, said the United States should not worry so much about the Soviet Union, which was really just a power on paper, and instead think about the things that actually made up the United States. Take seriously things like freedom and civil liberties and all of these things that differentiated US power from Soviet power and from the empty promises of authoritarian regimes abroad. Instead of worrying about what the other countries are going to do, focus on what is happening here in the United States. People ask me how I stay sane in my job, and one of the things I say about my job is that it's pretty refreshing when you focus mostly on the rest of the world's politics, because compared to the rest of the world, the United States has it tremendously easy. We are energy secure, we are food secure, we are the richest, most powerful nation in the entire world. Most countries would kill to have the types of problems that we have in this country. There are no problems that the United States faces that it does not have the resources to solve itself. There are very, very few countries in the world that can make an argument like that. China is certainly not one of them. They cannot grow enough food for their population. They cannot produce enough energy for themselves right now. You go down the list, there's so many ways that China and some of these powers are weaker than the United States. So when I look at global politics, it's actually somewhat refreshing. I see that the rest of the world has bigger problems than the United States. But then when you actually roll up your sleeves, not even roll up your sleeves, you turn on CNN on a Saturday morning and you see that instead of fixing all of these problems, which would do incredible things for US power and US prosperity, we are thinking about a Chinese spy balloon, and we're probably going to spend another $100 billion in defense spending just on spy balloon resistance or something similar and stupid. Now, I'm not somebody who thinks the United States is entering terminal decline. Remember, I think we're headed towards a multipolar world where the United States is not the top power in the world, but is still a significant power in general. The thing that I think should worry the United States, though, is our lack of ability to focus on the things that actually matter, to get together on things like infrastructure or social security or healthcare or education or all of these basic things that actually make life worth living, and which the United States' embarrassment of riches should allow it to give to its entire population in a more equitable way. And that's just not happening. So China doesn't need a spy balloon to see that its biggest rival, that it can't really hurt its biggest rival in any meaningful way, but that its biggest rival, the United States, is hurting itself in plenty of ways. Now, where do we go from here? I think that there was a similar moment to this in the United States in the mid to late 1920s, and I think there was a similar moment in the 1970s. And what happened in both of those situations was things got so bad that eventually people put aside their differences and you get new political coalitions in the United States and you get major change. So the 1920s obviously led to Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal. The stagflation era of the 1970s eventually led to Ronald Reagan and his quest for deregulation. Whether you like FDR or Reagan is really not the point here. I do think the United States is headed towards that sort of inflection point. The scary bit, though, is that at least according to our history, things are going to have to get a lot worse before we get on the same page. And my key takeaway from the weekend and from the spy balloon incident is that the United States is really not taking its problems seriously. And it is not devoting a lot of resources to actually fixing the things that could ensure American prosperity and even hegemony for a generation ahead. So China doesn't need a spy balloon to see that. All they have to do is turn into CNN if they can stomach it. So enough. I'll get off my soapbox and talk to y'all later. See you out there. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.